Hello, everyone, and we're really glad to. Are you with me, Vera? So we're starting, yeah?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're really glad to see as many participants. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. My name is Iman. I'm the Arabic language community facilitator for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergency, commonly known as INEE. I hope everybody hear me okay. If there is any issue, just raise your hand or tap on the questions so I can adjust or do anything. Can everybody hear my name and my voice clearly?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. So it's my honor to welcome you all in this webinar today, during which we will be discussing the Arab States 2019 GAM reports on migration, displacement, and education. Before we start, I need to run through a few housekeeping issues and items. Please ensure that your microphone is turned off for now, as well as probably your video, just to minimize the background noise. We do encourage participants to pose questions and as we go. So by the end of presentations, we will ensure that some of the questions are hopefully like as answered and addressed. And we would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the presentations will be shared on our INEE website, www.inee.org. Yes, as I mentioned, INEE is pleased to host this webinar, which is organized jointly with UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, GAM report, about migration, displacement, and education in the Arab States. As we may know, each year, UNESCO publishes an independent global education monitoring report to monitor the progress toward the educational targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, the GAM report launched a new regional report that shows major barriers that migrants and displaced people face to access quality and inclusive education. Unfortunately, no region is as affected by migration and displacement as the Arab States. This first regional edition of the GAM report analyzes the impact of these population movements on education systems in the region, and it presents a series of recommendations to protect the right of education of those on the move. The challenges call on education systems to adapt and require that states have the administrative, financial, and human resources capacity necessarily to effectively respond to the diverse and complex needs of these moving populations, from language courses to recognitions of qualifications. During this webinar, we will be exploring these challenges and how the report also sees these challenges as opportunities. So as we all know that an education system response is really vital, and education holds the key to preparing and welcoming migrant and displaced populations, strengthening their sense of belonging and supporting host communities. Education is a central part of the inclusion process. Let's first start with this webinar today with a short 4-minute video from the GAM report, sharing the voices from the real people experiencing migration and displacement in various ways and in various locations across the Arab state. So I'm just gonna play the this 4-minute video.
Around the world,
People are moving more than ever before. Of all the regions, the Arab states have been most affected by these movements in the past few decades. Megacities such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Casablanca have been absorbing millions of internal migrants. Migrants from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia have settled in large numbers in Western Europe.
D'accord. Donc, mes deux parents sont d'origine marocaine. Je pourrais dire que les opportunités que j'ai eues vraiment grandi en France en étant marocaine, c'est d'avoir une double culture, d'être mieux enrichie, entre guillemets.
The promise of better opportunities in the Gulf countries has resulted in the highest immigration rates in the world. This impacts on education. Students develop a sense of belonging.
We also accept non-Filipinos because we believe that education is for all. So this multicultural diversity is addressed through our programs that are geared towards holistic development.
However, not all movement is by choice. While the region is home to 5% of the world's population, it has more than a third of the world's refugees and internally displaced people. This is a unique situation. But whatever the challenges, displaced children and youth should not have to leave their right to an education behind.
Schools give a normal environment to children who have lost everything that was normal in their life. Education gives them a future when they're finally able to go back to their country.
Across the region, education policymakers and school systems need to work together to develop solutions that make sure no displaced children have to interrupt their education. Some refugee populations are still treated as temporary, but across the region, countries hosting Syrian children are working hard to include them in their education systems. Jordan and Lebanon adopted a double shift approach as the only realistic immediate solution to enrolling all their refugee children in school.
Thanks to the donors, the international community, thanks to the UN agency, UNICEF, UNHCR, I think we have succeeded in accomplishing two real miracles. One is saving a whole Syrian generation of children, and we have put the infrastructure for the future of a developed education in the host country, in my country, Lebanon.
But parallel systems are unsustainable in the long term, especially without better funding. The influx of refugees and migrants impacts on teachers too. They need proper training to deal with the trauma associated with displacement.
Çünkü biz savaş nedeniyle travma yaşamış, yakınlarını kaybetmiş öğrencilerle çalışıyoruz. Öğrencilerin problemlerine daha hassas yaklaşmamızı sağladı. Öğrencilerin problemi travma kaynaklı mı değil mi bunu ayırt etmemizde yardımcı oldu.
Policies need to accurately reflect refugee and migrant education needs. They must build bridges, not walls, allowing all children to reach their full potential.
أنا قبل ما كنت بعرف لا أكتب ولا أقرأ ولا شيء، كنت بس هلأ لما فتت على هالمدرسة أعرف أقرأ وأكتب، ولما حدا بيحكيني إنجلش صرت أعرف كيف.
جمال الدراسة أنا بحبها كتير وما بقدر أستغني عنها أبداً يعني. كنت بحلم بكون معلمة، لأنه عشان علم الأطفال ما عندهم علم.
Sorry. I just started. All right. So to help us flesh this topic out, I'm joined today by a number of presenters, very familiar with the report and also on the situation on the ground. I will introduce all the presenters now, and we will have the chance to hear from each one of the presenters in turn. First up is Matthias Eck, a researcher at the Global Education Monitoring Report. Prior to joining the GAM report, Matthias worked as education specialist for UNICEF, as a senior policy officer at the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and in various positions at UNESCO in the education sector and at the Bureau of Strategic Planning and at Stanford University. Matthew was a part of the small team that drafted the SDG for Education 2030 framework for education. Welcome, Matthew.
Hello, everyone.
Next, we will hear from Iman Assi and Sandra Hadi from the Lebanon Ministry of Education. Thank you for joining us. Iman Assi is a project coordinator in the General Directorate of Education at the Lebanese Ministry of Education and Higher Education. Iman's first job was a teacher, English teacher in one of the public schools in Beirut. At the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, Iman is the focal point and the coordinator for multiple development projects implemented in partnership with the international donors. Iman supported the activity design, implementation, follow-up, and monitoring and evaluation. She worked on designing a framework for school-based management at public schools. In her own work, Iman is committed to providing access to quality education to all children, especially the most vulnerable ones. She believes that in solidarity we can do it. Welcome, Iman. Next, we have Sandra George El Hadi. She's also based in Lebanon and works for the Lebanese Ministry of Education and Higher Education, where she supports the Director General of Education in managing projects and programs in collaboration with local, regional, and international partners. Her role involves close coordination with donors to ensure quality delivery of activities and initiatives in the ministry education sector in Lebanon. Prior to joining the ministry, Sandra worked with the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, as a coordinator and a researcher of a project on school-based management. Her role included moderating over 70 focal group discussions with principals, teachers, parents, and students, as well as contributing significantly to the drafting of guidelines for school improvement plans. Welcome, Sandra. Following them, we will have Irina Isomova. Irina is a senior regional educational officer at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, the UNHCR, Regional Bureau in Amman. Irina is currently working on providing technical advice and support to country teams in MENA region, on the development of guidance and approaches promoting the realization of the right to education for children and youth. Through her membership and participation in the regional expert groups on education, including Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, Irina advocates for education needs of refugees, internally displaced, and stateless children to be duly considered in design, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation processes, supporting through the national systems, as well as the humanitarian and development stakeholders. Irina has nearly 20 years of humanitarian work experience built through her protection and durable solutions assignments in Europe, Asia, Africa, and MENA regions. Welcome, Irina. And last but not least, we have two presenters from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees.
Hello. Hi, from one of them,
hi.
Caroline.
We have
Caroline.
Caroline,
yeah.
who has who has been the UNRWA Director for Education, UNESCO post since 2010. At that time, she has spearheaded an evidence-based system reform of the UNRWA education program and had led it on an innovative education in emergency approach. Prior to working to UNRWA, Caroline worked for UNESCO, for Dabit, and for the Commonwealth Secretariat. She also worked as a teacher and advisor in schools in the UK and Tanzania, and as a lecturer in universities in the UK. We have also her colleague Frosse Dabit. She's a senior education program specialist at UNRWA, headquarters in Amman, leading on UNRWA's Education in Emergencies program. Frosse has held several posts with UNRWA, UNESCO, and the Norwegian Refugee Council in Lebanon, where she has led the development and the scale-up of education program for Syrian and Palestinian response. She has also held several posts at the Palestinian Ministry of Education and Higher Education. We're really glad to have such a rich and diverse group of presenters and panelists today, and we're really privileged to have you all here with us in this webinar. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to lively and interactive webinar. Again, we do encourage our participants to pose questions on the chat area as we go. We will address as many questions following the presentation. If we can, please ensure our mics are muted for the time being, so everybody can hear the presenter quite finely. We also, for the social media users, we encourage using the Education on the Move hashtag to help us spread and raise awareness about the theme of this webinar. So it's Education on the Move. Now I would like to invite Matthias Eck to start off with a discussion about the learning from the Arab State GAM report. So it's over to you, Matthew.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation.
I think we have Matthew.
There it is. Okay.
I think there's an issue with the...
Well, I am very delighted to provide a brief overview. Can you hear me?
Matthias, yeah, the sound seemed to fade, and then now it's gone completely. Can you hear us?
I think we lost Matthew's, Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Maybe just for the sake of the bandwidth, maybe try to remove your video for now and see if that helps. Matthias, are you still there?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Would it be possible to put your camera off for now? Yes.
Now he has dropped off. Yes.
Okay.
We'll see if he comes back momentarily.
Okay.
If not, maybe we move to the next.
Maybe we can move
presentation
to
and come back. Yeah.
Anyway, we'll wait for. I think we'll start with. Is he back? I'm
back. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Matthew.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Connection is bad.
That's all right. Over to you.
Should I? I'm gonna try to share my PowerPoint again. I will keep the video off for the time being because I'm afraid that the connection is not very good.
Perfect. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to provide you with a brief introduction to the first regional edition of the Arab States Global Education Monitoring webinar of today. So this report 19 Global Education Monitoring Report but it also complements with fresh research, new insights into migration, displacement, and education. Some of the key findings and recommendations featured in the report. I would first like to thank INEE for having us. I would also like to thank the moderator and our panelists for joining us today. We are very grateful for your willingness to share your experience in addressing education needs of people on the move. So, as we've already seen in the video, and as has been...
We seem to have lost your presentation. Maybe it's coming back now, yeah. Perfect, yeah, go ahead. We can see it, but your sound is again very...
You hear me?
Very, barely, yes, but go ahead while it's good.
Okay. You hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay.
Still,
well,
like
as a result of the
keeps dropping off.
With Mediterranean having become a high migration route, Arab states are now actually the region most affected by migration displacement, which already mentioned earlier on. As you can see in the graphs, I hope, in the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, it keeps dropping off.
Matthias, I've gone to present the presentation for you in hopes that that's a better connection. Are you able to see it? Matthias, I'm doing the presentation, so if you want to go ahead and speak, and I'll move from the slides.
I'm back. I can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay.
And you can see the presentation?
I can see it on my screen. I am not able to move it.
I will move it if you just
fine.
let me know when. Yeah.
Okay, so we can go to the second slide. Yes.
Perfect.
So, well, I'm going to start again. So as a result of the Syrian and Yemeni wars, and with the Mediterranean having become a high-risk migration route, the Arab states are now the region which is most affected by migration displacement, as we have heard already during the video. As you can see in the graphs here, Lebanon is the country most affected by immigration, and UAE the country most affected by immigration in the region. Next slide, please. So the Arab states accounts for 5% of the global population, but 32% of the global population of refugees, and no less than 38% of the global population of people internally displaced by conflict. Now, the pace of urbanization and internal migration intensity are lower in the Arab states than they are in other regions. But the growth of mega cities like Baghdad and Cairo has been characterized by internal migration. The Maghreb has visited large-scale immigration to Western Europe, and countries like Qatar experience the highest immigration rates in the world. But this is not a report on migration and displacement per se. It is a report how these movements interact with education. It is about how teachers and education planners respond. It is about the need that migrants and refugees have for education, to thrive in their new homes, to feel that they belong. Next slide, please. So although migration offers opportunities, humanitarian crises have slowed down the pace of education development in the region relative to other regions. And this is actually undermining the prospects for this and future generations. So for instance, the enrollment rate in primary education, the gap between the Arab states and sub-Saharan Africa has more than halved over the last 20 years. If we can go back to the slides, thank you. And as you see in the graph, the Central and Southern Asia has overtaken actually the Arab states in the enrollment rate in lower secondary education. If you look into upper secondary total net enrollment rates, the Arab states exceeded the global average by 2.5 percentage points in 2005, but it fell short of it by 2.5 percentage points in 2017. Next slide, please. Migration and displacement can have both negative and positive effects on education systems. I'd like to start with the challenges first. While internal migration rates are lower in the Arab states than in other regions, internal migrants include children who are particularly disadvantaged and either receive education of insufficient quality or are out of school. So in Iraq, for example, 13% of the population lives in 3,700 slums, where there are almost 2,200 uncompleted schools. In Sadr city, the largest slum of Baghdad, 9% of inhabitants cite education as a top priority need. And in a quarter of slums of Cairo in Egypt, a general secondary education schools were situated far outside from the neighborhood, making it really hard to be accessed. International migrants' choices are also often limited to a private education system, where access and quality depends on their ability to pay. This is particularly the case in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. They have the highest immigration rates in the world, and immigrants make up 73% of private school students in Kuwait, and for example, 81% in Qatar. Displacement particularly affects low-income countries, and refugees more than migrants are out of school age, so half of them are under 18. They often arrive in parts of their host countries that have already challenges in education. Jordan and Lebanon adopted, for example, double shift systems. Natives attend in the morning and most Syrian refugees in the afternoon. While this is the only realistic solution in the short and medium term, it is not recommended in the long term. Next slide, please. So now I would like to talk about the opportunities. So migration displacement also represents an opportunity. Internal migration can bring benefits. The children who move from rural to urban areas, for example, often acquire more education than those who did not move. So in Egypt, children of internal migrants have a slightly lower dropout rates in primary and lower secondary education. They are more likely to persist into secondary and post-secondary education. Remittances are another example. They have a positive impact on household education expenditure. The countries receiving the most remittances are Egypt in absolute terms and Palestine in relative terms. Now, multiple factors need to be considered before concrete conclusions can be drawn about the education trajectories of students with immigrant backgrounds going from the Arab states to other countries. Now, our research has found that socioeconomic factors largely explain the education gap between natives and students of North African origins in France, for example. It also showed that immigrant parents and their children hold higher aspirations for education than natives. Now, refugees may be leaving their homes, but they also leave insecurity behind. There were 12,700 attacks on schools between 2013 and 2017 in conflict-affected countries, including in many countries in the Arab states region. Next slide, please. Now, the Syrian crisis has an obvious impact on the region. The 5 top hosting countries of the region are showing an overwhelmingly positive response to the arrival of millions of school-aged children, as this graph shows. In total, over 2.1 million Syrian school-aged children are in these top 5 countries, of which over 60% are enrolled in school, whether formal or non-formal. But challenges do remain. To complement the video we have seen earlier, 39% of Syrian children are still out of school in these countries. Now, the extent of inclusion is affected by geography, history, resources, and capacity. It can be gradual, like for example in Turkey, which is planning to phase out separate provision by 2020. It can also be partial, as in Lebanon or Jordan, where refugee students attend public education, but do not sit side by side with the other children. Next slide, please. Migration and displacement do closely interact with education. And this happens through complex two-way relationships that affect those who move and also those who stay behind. The importance of these relationships is why education-related commitments have made their way into the 2 global compacts on migrants and refugees adopted by states over a year ago. But how do these commitments, how should these commitments be achieved? And what are the priority actions? The report makes 5 recommendations, 5 main recommendations in that respect. Next slide, please. So first recommendation, governments need to protect the right to education of all people on the move. Just 2 years after the New York Declaration, where countries committed to provide education to refugees within 3 months, 1.5 billion school days of refugees have been lost. So countries need to protect migrants and refugees' right to education, regardless of ID documents or resident status. Expecting refugees to travel with school certificates is simply unrealistic. Policymakers must ensure their policies fairly reflect migrants and refugees' needs. For example, in Jordan, they let all primary school children enroll without certification. But then and in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, internally displaced students need original certificates to enroll in university. Stateless students can only attend fee-paying private schools in Kuwait, for example. Next slide, please. Now, second, migrant and refugee children need to be included in the national education systems. Immigrants should not be segregated. They should not be concentrated in specific schools. Bahrain, for example, provides open access to public schools for migrants. Now, where this is not possible, for example, in the Gulf states, they should monitor and enforce regulations on non-state providers of a parallel education system catering for immigrant students, ensuring equal quality standards are provided for all. Refugees should also spend minimal time in schools that do not follow the national curriculum, in different classrooms from natives as in Lebanon, or in courses not progressing towards recognized certificates, as such time compromises their education trajectories. Now, Turkey, as already said, has committed to include all Syrian children in public schools by 2020, for example. Next slide, please. The third recommendation is including migrants and refugees in national education systems is only the beginning, because what we need to do is to have a plan to respond to their needs. Now, this includes planned resettlements, investing in better data, providing social protection programs, and ensuring that migrant and refugee history is properly reflected in curricula. So, for example, construction companies in Casablanca, Morocco, do not only clear slums, but also identify new areas for schools. Tunisia, for instance, is a pilot project to track female child domestic workers. In Lebanon, a cash transfer program increased refugee school attendance by 20%. Now, in 2030, UNRWA introduced a framework to review host country curricula, for example. Countries need to provide accelerated education programs where education territories have been interrupted. The provision of such programs in countries with which large numbers of displaced populations, such as Iraq, has been limited for the time being. Next slide, please. Now, the key to all of these challenges is supporting teachers to take on this complex responsibility. Almost 3/4 of teachers in Syria had no training on providing psychosocial support. It is necessary to train teachers to deal with diversity, to confront stereotypes and discrimination, to recognize stress and trauma, and refer those in need to specialists. It is necessary to recognize the hardship under which some teachers are expected to work. In Iraq, for example, fragmented support to internally displaced teachers led to pay disparities and tensions. And as a consequence, the education cluster brought all partners together to coordinate incentives for those teachers. Many teachers in IDP settings are often not even paid. In Yemen, in the Houthi-controlled governorates, for example, teachers have not received their salaries since 2016. Next slide, please. And finally, financing education for migrants and refugees has all its cost implications. In the case of immigrants, the medium to long-term fiscal impact is small. After taking into account what services they use and what taxes they pay, the cost does actually not exceed minus to plus 1% of the GDP. But more could be done to target funds where needed most. In the case of refugees, there's a substantial lack of funding, which is also on the decline. For example, despite 3 pledging conferences for Syria, Jordan received 208 million instead of 250 million promised. Lebanon received 223 million instead of the $350 million promised. Now, in the case of refugees globally, the GEM report has estimated that 800 million was spent on their education in 2016. And this is roughly equally split between immediate response humanitarian aid and long-term response development aid. Planning for both needs to be done jointly with the government in charge, as Lebanon has done with its crisis response plan. And multi-sector planning should include the education. That's very important. The final slide, please. So those are the 5 main recommendations of the reports. Please do share these messages of the report. There's a link on the slide where you will find the report materials. It's also, of course, available in Arabic, the reports, and in English. And thank you very much for listening. I'm very much looking forward to the intervention of our partner afterwards and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was very informative, illustrative information and knowledge about the report. And now I would like to invite Iman, Assi, and Sandra Hadi from the Lebanon Ministry of Education to present on the webinar. Over to you.
Hello, this is Iman. I will start with the introduction. Do you hear me very well?
Yes, we hear you very well. Go ahead, Iman. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. We understand all the recommendations that you have presented to mitigate the challenges that the Syrian refugees are facing in my country, Lebanon. Well, as you have said, we have the highest ratio of refugees per capita. If you compare even in schools, we have an equal number of Syrian children in the afternoon shifts, same as the number of Lebanese children in the morning shift, around roughly maybe more than 200 school-aged children. So the Ministry of Education has done a lot of reforms and trials, and in coordination with the donor community. We first, as a country, as a government in Lebanon, we have the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan, where it was really written in coordination with partners, with UN agencies. And the thing is that there was a coordination mechanism between all ministries and actors in Lebanon who are related in a way to mitigate, the challenges that the Syrians are suffering, like the Ministry of Social Affairs, Ministry of Interior, Justice, Labor, Health. So we were working together and to support each other with initiatives that will make education better. So I can say that there was a recommendation to stop the second shift schools. First, I want you to understand that we didn't do it on purpose. At first, when the Syria crisis started, the Syrians were just registering in our schools, same as the Lebanese. And even until now, we have a big number of Syrians who are registered in Lebanese public schools. We stopped accepting Syrians to register in first shift in 2013 and 14 because the demand for places at the public schools, we could not really meet the demand. Some schools were overcrowded. We couldn't enroll all children. And as a government, we are committed to let every child have a proper education. So that's why we opened the second shift schools, and we kept opening every year. We have needs assessment, like we see where is the biggest demand for schools. So we open schools in those areas. And this year we have around 344 second shift schools out of, we have in total as a public schools, we have around 1,200. So you can see the amount of, or the capacity that was needed to open these schools. So what are we doing now after this changing from a humanitarian support to, as you said, we should take it as an opportunity to have it as a development approach. So what we're doing now in our annual working plans is based on needs assessment. We have identified areas where we need to have new schools to be constructed, and some schools to be rehabilitated or having an extension to have extra classrooms to absorb the numbers of students requested in that specific area. This will be also enforced by a maintenance policy that we are working on with the support of donors, so that all the funds that are spent on construction is really spent efficiently. If we try to make these accessible, then the second shifts will be requested and less. And if we have more classrooms to absorb the children. If we move inside, what we're doing these days, also in our annual, we are concentrating on teaching quality. So teachers are getting trainings on social emotional learning. It will be mainstreamed in all schools for teachers, principals. So they will integrate the social emotional ideas and approaches within their daily practices in the classroom or in managing the schools. Plus the need to do the, to ask school principals to do a yearly school improvement planning. And there was a request from the ministry that all schools should include both first and second shifts with same activities. Sometimes it's not easy to have them together in one activity. You should understand the challenges of numbers and the challenges of enough place to hold some activities, but many schools are doing combined activities between the two. And of course, we have the coaching system that is reinforced with our health advisors and health coaches and psychosocial support within the classroom. I can move to the how do we ensure that every child will get a proper education. We have the non-formal education pathways, which allows any student, school-aged child, to have a pathway to enter the formal education. We have the accelerated learning program or the basic literacy and numeracy. And we also opened 1 year preparatory year before grade 1. We called it preparatory early childhood, like a KG, kindergarten, 1 year before they enter the cycle 1. And we are also supporting the quality of non-formal activities related to retention and recreation for children. Like we regularized it by having specific SOPs for the BLN, for the ALP, and for the ECE, the community-based early childhood education, so that we ensure quality of services delivered to those children. This is mainly what I wanted to say about what we're doing now in Lebanon to really reach the recommendations in your report. And if you have any questions, you can pose it and we can answer it also later.
Yeah, thank you so much, Iman. That was really informative and telling us about the Lebanese experience. I'm just wondering whether Sandra would like to add anything here, or should we move to the next presenter?
Hi, I'm going to add just a few lessons that we learned from our experience over the past few years after the onset of the Syrian crisis. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes, we can, but we would really appreciate if you can be as quick as you can.
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to keep it short and sweet.
Cheers, thanks.
So just a few lessons. First, we learned that it's very, very important for finance to be sufficient, predictable, and in place for the long run. So that's something that I think donors should emphasize more, to make commitments to stable multi-year humanitarian funding. I think that would help us more in keeping Syrian children in school and making sure that they have access to quality education. And the second thing is that managing this emergency really needs, or any emergency really needs to be achieved through true partnership between host countries and the international community. So that's another thing that we learned. We're trying as much as we can to learn from our experience to create a stronger vision for the future. So it would be very important for us to develop multi-partner agreements on ensuring that we have a smooth, regular way of reporting with donors, instead of every donor having their own, so kind of like coordination between donors in how we deal with the crisis. And the third lesson that we learned, and that is very relevant now in Lebanon given the current economic crisis, is that coping with a protracted crisis leaves hosts highly vulnerable when additional shocks occur. And so we need to look into that as well. I think I just tried to very briefly summarize my 10-minute intervention into a 10-second intervention. So I hope that this kind of helps and doesn't feel like it's out of the blue.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. I think it's right to the point. And thank you so much, Iman and Sandra.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we would like to invite Irina from the UNHCR. It's over to you, Irina.
Thank you, Iman. I will just, I'm sharing the screen in a second. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for to INEE and the UNESCO organizers for this opportunity. I would like to welcome everyone. And further to colleagues' presentations, I'm excited to share some background on how UNHCR works in the region and globally on supporting the states, humanitarian and development actors. Sorry, I have some background noise.
Can we please ensure that the, I think it's from Ayash from the UNHCR. Can you hear us, Ayash? Can we please ensure that our microphone are muted for now? Oh, thank you. Irina, is that, I think it's okay, yeah.
Sure, thank you. So my presentation will basically touch briefly upon like how do we work with the governments and partners in addressing the barriers, and how do we ensure inclusion of refugee children and youth in national education systems. So let's move on. First, I would like to quickly reflect on the stark nature of the refugee and forced displacement crisis. It was already elaborated by Matthias in his presentation, but just to give you a very quick snapshot, indeed, MENA is hosting 5% of the world's population, but it embraces nearly a quarter of global population of concern to UNHCR. So this responsibility continued to, of course, to stretch economies, public and social services, and civil and political structures to the limits. The region has, I would like to emphasize here that we have multiple emergency situations, and which are very complex in nature. So Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Libya are example of that. The Syria crisis, which remains like a focus of our discussion. It is the largest displacement crisis in the world, with over 5.6 million registered refugees and over 6 million people displaced within Syria. But also, in our region, we host significant numbers of refugees and asylum seekers from Iraq, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Mali, and Guinea. It's also important to remember that North Africa presents different dynamics, and it appears to be the main gateway for sea arrivals to Europe, mainly from Morocco and Spain, with the smaller scale movements from Libya or Tunisia. In addition, we have also protracted camp situations, particularly in Algeria, where we have around 90,000 Sahrawi refugees, and Mauritania with over 50,000 Malian refugees. So education naturally continues to be an important response to the refugee and internal displacement crisis in the region, as it was emphasized by previous presenters. For us, it also serves as a key enabler for individuals and communities to build the capacities and skills they need to better protect themselves. It also increases self-reliance and facilitates social and economic integration. But we'll be also addressing the issue of barriers, which remain quite pertinent in education. And they include a wide range of protection and social economic challenges that contribute to negative coping mechanisms, such as child labor, early marriage, and recruitment by armed forces. Additionally, the Syria crisis continues to impose pressure on education services in host communities, especially in smaller countries where resources are particularly stretched. So across the region, we really need sustained support to ensure participation in quality education. And I think that was a point that was well emphasized by presenters from Lebanon. UNHCR works with the governments and partners to ensure that refugee children and youth could exercise their right to education. And of course, in our corporate strategy, Refugee Education 2030, it sets out a vision for inclusion of refugee children and youth in equitable quality education that in turn contributes to resilience and prepares them for participation in cohesive societies. Within the framework of the 3RP, that is Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, and No Lost Generation Advocacy Platform, UNHCR and partners continue to promote access to national education systems and enhance opportunities to post-basic and higher education. Our approaches are built on partnerships, collaborative learning, capacity building, innovation, evidence, and growth. So as a result of sustained engagement with the government for favorable policy responses in education for refugee learners and their increased attention to post-basic and tertiary education, there remains a strong interest of investing in education needs of young refugees to ensure transition to post-basic and higher education. Moving on. So to expand opportunities for refugees to participate in education in inclusive and equitable way, UNHCR, as UNHCR, we advocate with governments to establish policy frameworks that support refugees' access to national school systems, and also promote a one refugee policy so that refugees and asylum seekers of different nationalities have similar access to services. We have seen varying practices in different countries. I think Turkey might be a good example of where one refugee policy approach has been adopted gradually in the response platform. We work with the governments to put in place administrative procedures to ensure that administrative barriers to school access are removed. And this includes adaptation of identification documentation requirements for admission to school, and also the recognition and use of identity documents issued by the governments to refugees and asylum seekers, and recognition of prior learning experience, of course. We support system strengthening, and that remains a quite important area of engagement for us. And in this area, we are working in partnership with government to support teacher trainings on working with refugees. And we also extend our interventions to integration of psychosocial support into classroom practices. We also pay attention to working with children to promote social cohesion between host and refugee communities. I think this part has become increasingly important over the years of protracted nature of the response in the region. So UNHCR also engages with the government partners in development and implementation of response strategies so that refugee response strategies are fully owned by hosting governments. In the Syria response, for instance, we liaise with the governments to develop country-level 3RP, Refugee Response and Resilience Plan chapters that are discussed with the government stakeholders and help support the creation of a common platform around which all elements of education response can work together to achieve common goals. We work also in partnership with others, of course, to ensure the right of education for refugees, and strategic partnerships such as partnership, for instance, UNHCR has with the Education Above All Foundation's Educate a Child program, EAC. Such partnerships have proven successful in increasing refugee children's access to quality education through sustained and long-term efforts. To give you a more precise picture, since 2012, EAC, Educate a Child, and UNHCR have enrolled over 1.2 million out-of-school refugee and internally displaced children in primary school, and 426,000 of out-of-school children got enrolled across Arab countries, Syria and Yemen alone. So we also in these partnerships, these partnerships are based on the concrete translation of the commitments that were expressed by the states in the New York Declaration and the Global Compact on Refugees. we know that administrative barriers often prevent young refugees, refugee women and men from entering tertiary education. And to address these barriers, UNHCR is leading several efforts at the same time in collaboration, of course, with the hosting governments, humanitarian and development stakeholders. On the screen here, you have few examples, but perhaps, and some of them have already been emphasized by the previous presenters, and they fall in line with the recommendations proceeding from the GEM report. Perhaps I would like to talk about only like three or four, if the time allows. The admission procedures. Yeah, the admission procedures, they remain important part of our intervention. We're trying to make sure that admission procedures are responsive to the types of individual identification that refugees have. We also work with partners in host and home countries to obtain education completion certificate. And you probably heard about the UNESCO's Global Qualification Passport, which we're endorsing, and as a tool that could really facilitate recognition of prior learning and academic and professional qualifications. So we do have a scholarship portal where we disseminate accurate information about the scholarships and supporting also student clubs and networks. We also advocate for refugees to have access to financial services, which remains a very important intervention in their case, and that allows them, enables them to continue education, to continue education. And lastly, I would like to mention that UNHCR actively supports the establishment and expansion of third country scholarships programs, and we facilitate applications to the scholarship participation by Syrian and other refugees in those opportunities. But these all interventions are of course done in protection sensitive manner and in a full respect of principle non-refoulement. So I stop here. Iman, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Irina. As you may know, we're already 5 minutes over the allocated time for this webinar, but we will be carrying on for additional 10 to 15 minutes. I know it's over the allocated time, but for those who would like to leave, we would like to assure you that the presentation and the webinar will be recorded and will be available online. And now, I'm pleased to pass on the microphone to Caroline and Frosse from UNRWA. Over to you. Caroline. I think you're muted, Caroline or Frosse. I don't know who's starting first.
Sorry, I forgot the other one.
Here you go.
Unmute, sorry. I'll go quickly. As I said, the key issue is we're a very different story. UNRWA is a very different story, but we've got part of the other story over the last years with the Syria conflict. So we talked at the beginning about how parallel systems, can't really be in place for very long, but actually UNRWA is a parallel system and it's been in place for, 70 years. So there's always anomalies. And maybe how we managed to be in place as a parallel system, which we're not advocating as an approach, of course, is perhaps our close relationship with the host governments. So we work very closely with the host governments and we follow the host curriculum. So I think back in the day with the refugee issues, maybe you didn't follow the host government curriculum. And it's now, obviously very much recognised that you should. So we always did. And just a pointer now with regard to that, you talked about the government curriculum framework. This is just a curriculum framework with regard to reviewing those 4 host government curriculum that we use. That's Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, West Bank and Gaza is the same as Palestine and Jordan, just to review them in terms of it does what we want it to do as a UN agency. In terms of the good things, the skill building, the competency building, but also, the identity of the Palestinians. So that's important for all refugees. that we try to see it reflects the identity of the Palestinians somehow. That's something additional we have to bring. And then, of course, as a UN agency, we also have to look at curriculum with regard to UN values, and that's a particularly tricky issue for us with the textbooks of the Palestinian Authority and the criticism they receive. Politically driven, I'd like to say. So we are a different system. We've been there around for 70 years. We've had a strong, we are, UNESCO. It's very important to say that. I am UNESCO. UNRWA was set up by, I think it was the Quakers in terms of, UNRWA education, and then UNESCO took over in the early 1950s. I don't know if I can go through those slides. Can you just show the slides very quickly, please? Because I think I'm talking about them. Yes, so at the moment, 533,000 students, 709 schools, all of them closed, because we like to keep this very up to date. So across the fields, we now have 533,000 children and all the children from the vocational centres all at home. And this is a very different education and emergency issue. It is not the same as what we did before, when we can bring children together, when we can do this, when we can do that. Very, very different. And we're really having to think about how to approach this issue. So UNRWA education, what was the secret in terms of the refugee education, why it's been such good quality? I think the secret is that it was always about everything. It was always, as you said, a parallel system. We have the INEE norm, framework in terms of all the areas that you have to think about. And of course, as an education system, UNRWA always thought about that. It always thought about teachers. It did think about, the curriculum. It did think about inclusive education, and it did think about measurement. And just to go down a slide very quickly to the third one, yes. But one thing that we were working on since 2010 was trying to further strengthen that system. We're trying to further strengthen it with regard to, everything kind of joined up, everything working together, the policies giving us a direction. And I think this would apply for any refugee situation, knowing what you're trying to achieve, the frameworks, the structures in place, and then ensuring that we build capacity within that. So this systemic approach, I think, was very key for a successful education system, to really see what you can do, whether you're parallel, whether you're integrated, seeing how you can actually have that systemic approach, how you can link up, maybe in a transitional way with a host government. You can't automatically go in the same way, maybe you're in the afternoon schools, etc., but bit by bit to kind of link up with those systems and to also add value as a system, as a refugee migration system, to see how you can add value to those systems and strengthen them for the benefit of all. And that's another important thing, I think, with regard to refugee communities, is what they bring to the other communities. I think one of the slides said about the value of that, but I think educationally, to add value in terms of what you bring, whether it's in terms of the teacher training or whatever, and I think that's very key. Just to go through very quickly, because I'm not talking about all these, please go on. Next one. Just very quick. That's where we work. I just mentioned it. Next one, please. Next one. Okay, so, but now I just want to say that we had the challenges of being a refugee system, of being parallel, but trying to obviously have that kind of cohesion, working alongside, following the host country curricula, the study plan, etc. And then the Syria war began, which is still going now, as you know. And then we had to really think about what to do in that context, given that we had a 70-year system, but given that our children, our Palestine refugees from Syria were displaced within Syria multiple times, but also across to Lebanon and to Jordan to a lesser extent. So we very much had to think what to do, with those displaced, doubly displaced, because of course their parents have been displaced, or grandparents, and now here they were displaced again. And Frosse is just going to quickly go through our approach there. Is that okay, Frosse?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. I don't think I can put my picture on because I'm displaying the presentation.
Oh, yes.
But basically, like as Caroline mentioned, the operational context in which UNRWA operates is very much problematic. For example, in the West Bank, we have 50 years of occupation. In Gaza, 14 years of blockade. Lebanon, we have all seen the instability recently in the country. Syria, 9 years of war. And today, as Caroline mentioned, our 709 schools are closed, and we're really working around the clock to see what we can do in order to maintain the right of education for Palestine refugees in such a context. And going back to the response to the Syria crisis, because that's probably the case that I will be presenting now, it's more that we did not drop our overall objective. Our overall objective is to have children, Palestine refugee children, accessing quality, inclusive, and equitable education. Okay, crisis happens, we don't drop that, and we try to maintain this through investing and building on the 70 years education system that UNRWA had in place, through introducing innovative ways of doing things differently. Like, for example, we introduced the UNRWA self-learning program, which when children cannot come to schools, we send the materials to them. And we supplemented this with an UNRWA TV channel that was broadcasting from Gaza and is now on YouTube channel. We also had the interactive learning website, which includes educational games for children in core subjects. We also emphasized psychosocial support, and we understood the importance of having additional counselors in situations where the conflict is happening. We emphasize recreational activities. We emphasize further parental engagement. And we also focus on things that were not the focus before, such as safety and security in the schools. So this is in summary our approach of building on the system, but introducing innovative ways of doing things differently in order to maintain the overall objective and ensuring right to education. I think this is something that Caroline probably wanted to speak about, but I don't know if I would just continue. No,
just continue, Frosse, please.
Okay. Is emphasizing measurement within it all. And UNRWA has in place a common monitoring framework where we have indicators that look at outcome level indicators, survival, dropout rates, achievement of students. And in order to strengthen also the measurement of the education and emergencies program, we have put together a bank of indicators that includes key indicators that help our fields to measure key issues relating to our education and emergency response, building again on the overall common monitoring framework that we have in place. And we have agency-wide studies that are conducted that help us to also see the performance of the program, such as perceptional surveys, classroom observation studies, monitoring learning achievements, and dropout studies. The UNRWA education program was highlighted by the World Bank as a good education system. From the World Bank, its UNRWA schools continually and consistently outperform public schools by a margin to more than one additional year of learning. This can be found in the Learning in the Face of Adversity World Bank report. Also, our education and emergency program was quoted as part of the promising practices for refugee education. And this can be accessed also in the UNHCR, Pearson, and Save the Children publication on promising practices for refugee education. I would end by emphasizing the issue of psychosocial support, because we were asked to focus our presentation also on this. UNRWA addresses psychosocial support for children through a systemic approach. We have policies and strategies in place. And here I would quote the inclusive education approach to psychosocial support. But of course, in times of crisis, we rely more on counselors, so thus we deploy additional counselors. We emphasize a lot recreational activities, and for that we have put in place a recreational manual that our teachers can use and counselors can use in times of crisis and in everyday teaching. As well as for trauma support, here we have strong partnerships, like for example with the Norwegian Refugee Council in the Better Learning Program, where we look at referral, and we are working further to strengthen the area of case management and referral within UNRWA. I don't know if Caroline, you want to add anything, but otherwise I think we try to stick to time as well.
No, I mean, only just to say that, you know, it's very interesting because, you know, we haven't got displacement at the moment. We've got the opposite in terms of emergency we're following it now, but because everything's so different, we have to think about in terms of how we do things. And it's a real eye-opener. Just to say that we are now thinking how to support those 533,000 children who actually can't move and are living in a completely different situation. And it's very challenging. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caroline and Frosse. And now we are heading toward the Q&A finally. I'm just aware that we are 17 minutes over time. So we don't have that much time to go through all these questions. Luckily, most of the comments and the questions have been already addressed by our presenters. But we would like still to address two questions. Let me, where are the documents? Yes, here. So the first question is from Abdesalam El-Jofi, directed to Matthias. Abdesalam asks or starts his question by comment saying, we're surprised that no presentation about the Arab regional organizations such as the Arab Bureau of Education of the Gulf States and the Arab League Educational Cultural Scientific Organization. And it seems some information gaps on the report stem from the not accessing these organizations. I'm just wondering whether you would be able to address this question, Matthias, please.
Yes, well, this is the first time we're doing this regional report. We have been doing a launch in Qatar as well with partners, with regional partners who were on the ground. So for any future reports, of course, we will try to collaborate closely with those regional organizations in order to make sure that we get all the relevant inputs into the next report.
Beautiful, thank you so much, Matthias. And the second question is from Malak Bokosh. She says, thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question. Do we have examples of initiatives that work to address the birth registration when unavailable or visa issues, both as possible prerequisite for school registration? Have you come across examples of accelerated educations or bridging classes? So basically there are two questions here. One has to do with the addressing the birth certificate and the visa as a prerequisite for joining the schools. And the second question about the accelerated education or bridging classes. And basically the two questions are directed to our respective panelists.
Iman?
Yes.
Perhaps I could try and answer the first question concerning the birth registration. Because birth registration is a component that remains present very strongly across all UNHCR protection interventions. So particularly, I think, I'm not sure if the question was related to Yemen or it was just a quotation there. So we do have within the ongoing programs on legal aid and assistance, we do provide support to refugees and asylum seekers with regard to birth registration. But that is, of course, being a state function, we do facilitate, we do support the authorities on the way to, to ensure that children are registered. in timely. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation, the documentation remains a key requirement at all stages, whether we are talking about primary, secondary, or tertiary education. So we do have a follow-up done at all levels of education, and this is, of course, primarily done through our implementing partnership arrangements, as well as the advocacy interventions vis-a-vis the authorities.
Thank you so much, Irina.
Hi, Iman.
Yeah,
Can I?
absolutely.
Hi, Iman. Can I just have a comment with regard to?
Yes, please, Mohammed. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's Mohammed from Egypt. Thanks a lot anyway for all the presentations. It was absolutely excellent. In the absence of documentations in terms of birth registration, birth certificate, previous academic experience or anything, the Ministry of Education in Egypt sets a placement test for all the children who don't have documentations. So if you say you're age 9, that's primary 3, for example, they give you the exam for primary 2. And if you pass the exam, you're housed in primary 3. And again, these are 4 subjects, only the 4 main subjects, and it's quite a very short exam just to determine your level. So there are solutions around it, which is, that's what you say your age, that's the exam for the previous year of your age. If you pass it, then you're housed in that grade. If you don't, then you stay in the lower grade. So that's one element. There was also another one, which is social cohesion. And I would like to also mention our experience in this. We had a couple of projects between obviously host community children and refugee children in public schools. And it's a project called A Playground for All of Us. And that project was designed with students from Faculty of Arts and their professors, the children, their teachers, and their parents in each school. They design what they would like to have in the playground. They design their play area according to their age. Then it's implemented with the assistance of the children in a safe environment. So the gravel and all the hard work is done by the contractor, but all the woodwork, the painting, everything is happening with the children. It makes them feel that they are one community. We've implemented this in 14 different schools across Egypt in the areas most impacted by the refugee crisis. And I think the results were absolutely excellent. Also, it was sustainable because the children feel they own the playground. They own what they've created, and therefore it would not be demolished. So there are a few things that we, in that respect. There was also a question on literacy. And I have here books that we've designed with the Ministry of Education. That's UNHCR and the Ministry of Education. For primary 1 children, for primary 2 children who are in public schools, and for primary 3 children, again in public schools. These are excellent qualities books for all the children and the host community children in primary 1, 2, and 3. You're talking about 1.8 million children received this book. But then we have the other system, which is the community schools, which is mainly teaches the Sudanese curriculum. Our partners like that Save the Children in a project with the EU designed this again as an accelerated learning program for primary 1, 2, and 3. So children who come and they've missed a number of years of their education at the early age can actually be enrolled in these courses. There are so many examples in the region, and I think obviously the time will not allow for all of them, but I just wanted to clarify the issue with the birth certificate, the accelerated learning program. The bridging program is very important when it comes to transferring from the informal education system to the national education system. And I think that's what's happening at the moment with us. We are trying to stop that parallel system of the Sudanese community schools in here, which has about 17,000 kids. If you have access to public education, then you go to public school. But at the same time, and it's a plea maybe for everyone and for donors as well, if we are encouraging mainstreaming into the national education system as a more sustainable option for refugees and for us as well as agencies, because funding is not coming that as it used to, or as it used to be. Therefore, we're asking donors not to support or not to fund so many activities when it comes to the creating the parallel systems, unless it's absolutely necessary. We are getting this, obviously, a lot of people are getting funds. A lot of agencies are getting funds to support the parallel systems, which is, yes, it's fine, but it does defeat the purpose of trying to mainstream refugees into the national education system for sustainability and also for certification and accreditation future for these generations when they return to their homes, or if they are going to be resettled elsewhere. Thank you, Iman.
That's beautiful, Muhammad. Thank you so much for sharing the experience from Egypt. And with Muhammad, we have reached the end of our more than 1 hour now. And I want to thank each one of you, our presenters, our participants, for such a lively discussion. It was an incredible opportunity of learning and exchange. Just a final reminder that the recording and the presentations from this webinar will be posted on the INEE website very soon. Stay tuned and we will share these links with you. Until next time, thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.